Hello, welcome to our seminar, Art, Political Culture, and Civic Life. Today we're going to discuss the topic, happiness. What does it really mean? Joining us are our political philosopher and author of a new book, Happiness in Action, A Philosopher's Guide to the Good Life, Adam Sandell. And Randall Kennedy, who teaches at Harvard Law School and has written many books on race and the law. And as well, Pratap Mehta, coming to us from India, a political philosopher and one of India's leading intellectuals. So Adam, tell us, what does happiness really mean? What are the deeper sources of happiness?
One answer to that question is that it's the fulfillment of our goals, that when we're active, when we're striving, we're aiming at something. It could be a personal goal. It could be a big social or political goal, making the world a better place, however you might conceive of that. And we tend to think of activity that's meaningful in terms of activity that is oriented toward the right kind of goal, or at least the right kind of goal for me that will bring meaning to my life as an individual. But I try to argue that that's not right, that there is something fleeting about our goals and even our greatest achievements, a certain instability to them, that we achieve them, maybe we celebrate for an evening, and then we wake up the next morning or a few days later, and we ask, well, what now? What am I going to pursue now? And that's kind of over and done. It's behind me, on to the next goal, or on to, taking something higher and farther. And there's this kind of endless cycle of achievement and emptiness. And on the other side of that, our goals weigh on us while we're pursuing them. We are often plagued by this sense, if I don't finish this project on time, my life in some sense is going to be a failure. If I don't, get the right job or buy the house or, get married at this stage in life, somehow my life in a sense is not going well. So there's an immense anxiety, I think, that we face when we define our happiness in terms of the striving for goals. And then there's this real kind of emptiness, malaise that besets us when we actually reach our goals, and then we realize, well, I thought this would change my life. I thought this would bring me the fulfillment that I sought. Actually, it doesn't. I'm just the same guy, and no better, really, no happier. So what kind of activity do we have to engage in to realize happiness? And the answer that I try to work out, drawing on ancient philosophy, going back to Plato and Aristotle, and really the life of Socrates, who's my exemplar in the book, is activity that we do for its own sake, that's non-goal oriented, that is intrinsically worthwhile while we're in the midst of it, that involves struggle, perhaps hardship and overcoming, but that we stick with because it's motivating and inspiring, and it speaks to some sense of self, to a personal narrative, to a journey in which we're immersed, and that motivates us quite apart from whether we succeed or fail. So how to specify this kind of activity? I suggest that there are three virtues that are integral to activity for the sake of itself, and that's self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature. And we can talk more about those virtues, but just very quickly as an overview, self-possession, kind of a sense of self that involves judgment, exercising your own judgment based on the narrative arc of your life and what's good for you, preserving your judgment against the tendency of technology to disburden us of judgment, of experts in our lives to disburden us of judgment, kind of being yourself. Also standing up to those in your life who may be, sources of authority, people who will help you get what you need, but, instead of catering to them constantly, being able to preserve yourself and to say, well, whatever I want to achieve is just not worth sacrificing my sense of personal dignity. So I draw upon Aristotle and his idea of greatness of soul in that regard. And then friendship. I think friendship resists a goal-oriented culture because friendship in the highest sense, one could say, is useless from the standpoint of achieving a goal. We're just hanging with our friends. We're having a good time. We're sharing stories. We're celebrating in good times, taking comfort in bad times. We're learning from each other, gaining a sense of self through growing up together, sharing experiences. And there's a distinction, I think, that's very important between a friend and an ally. That in a goal-oriented life, in a goal-oriented culture, we have many, many allies, people who will help us achieve an aim, who will, help us do what we want to do in the world. But they're not really our friends. I mean, they might also be our friends, but an ally alone isn't a friend. So recovering a sense of friendship is part of this journey of life, a journey of self-discovery. And finally, engagement with nature, the natural world, the things that come upon us, quite apart from what we will or choose. Nature in the sense of the weather, the path of the stars, the change of the seasons. But also in terms of, sudden disruption. We saw what Hurricane Ian did to Florida, a natural disaster. How do we contend with nature? How do we both attend to nature and embrace it and attempt to interpret it in a way that can give our lives meaning? And how do we also contend with it? To what extent do we resist nature? I think is a very fundamental question, and one that these days doesn't get adequately addressed, because we conceive of nature primarily in terms of simply an adversary, something to be mastered, to be conquered, to be appropriated for our purposes. So those are the three virtues that I suggest are integral to the kind of activity that is constitutive of happiness, and that constitutes a good life. And what I try to do is go back to ancient philosophy to really elicit these virtues.
I thoroughly enjoyed the book, Adam. And one of the reasons I thoroughly enjoyed it is because your description of the problem was me. It was a wonderful description of, my sensibility, the way I do things, my compulsions. I am enthralled to what Kiku referred to at the outset as the tyranny of goal-driven life. Yes, I am a slave to goal-driven life. And I thought of that in all seriousness this morning when I was, when I got up and I was thinking about the session, and I, pulled the book down, and at the very end of the first paragraph, you have that question, and you mention it again in your presentation: what now? And this is a question that's always on my mind. I mean, I'm in my house here. I'm an empty nester. My kids are up and doing their thing. So that what now is they're doing their thing. I don't have to really worry about them. I'm in a job where I've loved for a long time. But what now? And what now? And that is always on my mind. I mean, already we're just in October, and I'm already looking, going online, looking at websites about New Year's resolutions. I have a real thing with New Year's resolutions. Love New Year's resolutions, writing them down, really getting into it. So I thought you did a really wonderful job of describing that sort of life and sensibility and problems with it. Having said that, I want to defend my way of life and ask, I have a couple questions. Is ongoing dissatisfaction interrupted intermittently by feelings of achievement? is that bad? You know, you talked in your remarks, Adam, you used the word fleeting. You talked about, you know, you have these goals and you achieve a goal and you have a fleeting feeling of success and happiness and satisfaction, but you emphasize, but it's fleeting. You know, 2 days later, you have this empty feeling. I think you're right. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. And my question is, you know, okay, what's wrong with that? Why is that not that's me. Why is that not a good way of living? What about the problem of complacency? I notice in a bunch of literatures of all sorts, there seems to be a sort of good enoughism. So for instance, I was reading a book the other night called Marry Him. It was a Lori Gottlieb. It's a book aimed at women, and basically the message of the book is too many women are too picky, and they, instead of seeing the good in the partner who they have, they're constantly sort of looking around because they don't want to settle. And her message was, grab the person next to you and make do with them, and and be happy. Don't have this sort of sense of tomorrow I might come across Robert Redford or something. And again, so and in other literatures, what about good enoughism? What isn't there a problem with this? The striving life, the anxiety, around it. And I hear that, but what about the problem of complacency? It seems to me that's a real danger. And I'll end my initial comments by saying, I wonder what it would feel like to have a steady state of feelings of satisfaction. I've never had that. Maybe it would be good, but maybe not. A steady state, and I'd ask you to think about this. A steady state. So your idea is luxuriate in the journey. Don't worry about the destination. Luxuriate in the journey. Well, maybe. Though when you were writing your book, I assume that, I'm sure that you were enjoying writing the book, activity for its own sake. I'm also sure, though, that, you did have, some sort of deadline imposed, or, deadline for yourself. You did like getting to a certain point. You did like getting to the destination, namely a published, wonderful book. Can we do without destinations? Can we do without, I suppose we can. Do we want to do without destinations? Do we want to do without the sort of striving upon which you put such, useful scrutiny?
Thanks, Randy, for those questions. I do have to disagree with what you said at first, though, when you said your life was so thoroughly dominated by the goal-oriented perspective, because I've known you for a long time, and you have a good deal of self-possession that I find admirable and inspiring, and you're a good friend. So I think you sell yourself short. Maybe your ideology isn't quite in line with your actual life. But I want to address first your first question. Well, why is it bad to have fleeting satisfaction? Isn't it enough to have a life where I achieve a goal and I reap some pleasure, and then it goes away, and then I go after the next goal. One way to look at it is this: are there not certain qualities of character, certain virtues that you wouldn't want to be fleeting, or if you recognize that they were fleeting in your own person, that you would feel compelled to try to improve upon them for your own sake? Take bravery, for example. If I'm a person who strives to be brave, but my bravery is fleeting, that in all sorts of circumstances, when I, aspire to stand tall, I shrink back. That's a fleeting kind of existence, and it's not good. I mean, it's not good for yourself. If your bravery was fleeting in that way, you would try to do something about it. Thinking about the kind of virtues in which we take pride and give us a sense of deep personal satisfaction. The life of Socrates, I think, is a good example. He's Plato's emblematic character of self-possession, somebody who really maintains his core throughout the entirety of his life. He is the philosopher hero, at least as he's portrayed by Plato, probably in a very idealized way compared to the actual Socrates, but somebody who lives his life as a unity, no matter what the circumstance. He pursues the truth. The unexamined life is not worth living. And he pursued the truth with such confidence that throughout the ups and downs of his existence, when he was challenged by people, by famous people, by orators who denounced his way of life, he engaged them in conversation. He never took offense. He never got flustered. He always wanted to learn from within their own perspective, and eventually had the resource to show them that they ultimately agreed with him, even though they didn't know it, because they were so confused and partial in their way of looking at things. He's on trial in front of 500 Athenian citizens who are going to condemn him to death, and who do condemn him to death. And he maintains that he won't recant his way of life. He's going to continue pursuing philosophy. And when they ask how he should be punished, he says, I think my punishment should be public support for life, because I actually do a service to Athens. I don't corrupt the youth. I improve them. So you should pay me. That should be my punishment. That's some bravery. That's some self-possession. Even his death, which again, I'm sure is highly stylized by Plato, but you have the executioner coming in because he has so much respect for Socrates that he bursts into tears as he's handing him the cup of hemlock that Socrates has to drink. And Socrates accepts it and just drinks it down and continues talking until gradually he sits down and lies down, and the life gradually escapes his body. So it's a caricature in a way, but I think it's Plato's way of saying, like, look, this is really what a good life is about. This is what a fulfilling life is about. This is what a happy life is about. Again, happiness in a deeper sense of being oneself throughout the ups and downs and terrible turns that life can take. And I say caricature because it's aspirational. It's a certain ideal, and I think Plato knew that. But it shows, I think, why when you say, well, fleetingness, is fleetingness a bad thing? Yeah, it is. When we talk about the deeper qualities of soul, and I don't mean that in a condemnatory sense, because I think all of us fall short, and we can look at
power to live on purpose.
Let's get Adam back.
Yeah.
And mute whoever this is making noise. Okay, Adam, just continue. Sorry for that interruption.
Anyway, I think that when we think of why fleetingness, as Randy said, is a bad thing, well, it's self-defeating. It's ultimately not what will bring one fulfillment. And I think if we look at virtues, I use the example of self-possession, Socrates, but friendship as well. Would we want our friends to be fleeting? ideally not. I mean, friends that are fleeting aren't as good as friends who are stable and who are always with you and have your back. And might the same not also be true for the various particular goals that we pursue, that really, if they matter to us, whether it's writing a book or setting a record in pull-ups, there's something motivating about the goal and inspiring about it. But is it not possible to live with, to continue to live with a sense of joy in the accomplishment, not simply as an accomplishment, but as an expression of self-possession, friendship, engagement with nature? And I think about this a lot in my own life, and in this strange journey of setting records and pull-ups, that there's something that is very satisfying about setting the goal, but it is fleeting. So then you find yourself asking, well, what is it that I carry with me? And it's the friendships, it's the people that you meet who you otherwise would never have made contact with in your life, and the way that they've supported you, and also the way you've learned from them. Speaking of the engagement with nature, it's the struggle with the pull-ups bar and coming to understand yourself in partnership with gravity, that pulls you down, but is actually that force that you need to get a strong grip and to pull yourself up. So there's this kind of unity or harmony between your own power and the forces of nature. And that doesn't go away, because everything you do in your life involves that kind of engagement with nature. And you can come to see it that way from the perspective of what at first seemed to be a very goal-oriented activity that brought only fleeting satisfaction. And finally, Randy, with respect to good enough, yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that for sure, but I would say that good enough is an antidote to the goal-oriented life, in which we think we have to achieve one thing, then the next thing, and keep aspiring for higher, more prestigious achievements. And good enough is a perfectly healthy antidote to that, because otherwise there's always going to be somebody better than us. Even Usain Bolt with his 100-meter sprint record, that's going to be broken someday, probably, maybe soon. And when we look at the vast expanse of time that society will prize the activity of running 100 meters as fast as you can, who knows? Every achievement is fleeting. So the philosophy of good enough may be a healthy corrective to trying to go higher and further in your goal-oriented striving. But I don't think good enough is as compelling when it comes to virtues like friendship and self-possession, courage. So I'll leave it at that. I definitely want to continue the discussion and hear what others have to say, and of course hear what Pratap has to say.
Thanks, Adam, for a wonderful book. And frankly, at one level, I have like so many questions. So don't worry, I won't inflict all of them on you today. Let me maybe, just to open up this discussion, begin with 2 or 3 observations. I mean, one, listening to the exchange between you and Randy, I'm reminded of that old joke. A philosophy student walks into a class and says, "Professor, is Socrates right that the unexamined life is not worth living?" And the professor says, "Absolutely." The second student walks in and says, "But Bernard Williams said the unexamined life is not worth living is a patent falsehood, that there can actually be rich and interesting and happy lives that don't involve self-examination." And the professor says, "Yes, that's absolutely right." The third student walks in and says, "How can you say to both of them that they're right?" And the professor says, "Well, you're also right too." And I suspect that this discussion, has in a sense that quality that I think, given the variousness of life in some ways, it's not easy. It's easy to imagine, in a sense, both narratives, Randy's narrative and Adam's, yours, being compelling. And I'll return to this point later, perhaps more clearly. But let me more seriously. So, to me, the most stunning part of the book was the way it forced this question about kind of what makes for a happy life. And there are 4 or 5 distinct components you run together, I think, as elements of that. And I want to sort of just lay that out because I think they actually don't come as a package. And it might be that Randy's answer is a response to one of those components in a way that might be, I think, more compelling than your answer. And your answers are more compelling in relation to some of the others. So the first and the most important element, which is really powerful and it's tinged with such an evocative religious sensibility, is the idea of the non-instrumentality of every moment we live. And I think Michael Oakeshott, I think I mentioned this in an email to you, has this extraordinary essay, Religion in the World, probably the best essay ever written by a political philosopher on religion, where he in a sense begins by saying that the essence of a religious sensibility, as far as he sees it, is can you live life in a way in which every moment you live has a meaning that is not instrumental to something outside of itself. Right? He says, for what, after all, could any notion of life be more empty and futile than this idea that the value of every moment is measured by its contribution to something else or something more permanent than itself. Right? So the first element is this really extraordinary, but what would it mean? The sense of joy, that would come from where the infinity of existence is not by stretching it out into eternity. It's in the sense experiencing in the intensity of that moment, right? So this non-instrumentalism, which I find the most powerful and compelling idea, and that's the strand that runs through the 3 virtues you want, right? Friendship as an exemplarity, as an example of that non-instrumental relationship. Our relationship to nature is an example of that non-instrumental relationship. And even self-possession, in some senses, is given content, right, by this idea, in some senses, that we are not instrumentalizing ourselves and our lives to something that is kind of fleeting, permanent, and outside. So that's, I think, the most, and that's the part of the book that, in a sense, that I find most compelling. Now, in relation to that, the question, I'll reinterpret Randy's question slightly, is you're looking for a permanent set of virtues, a permanent orientation to life captured by this idea of non-instrumentality. But does that require that your goals not be fleeting? In fact, you could argue that the stronger you have this character of non-instrumentality, the more you can actually, in a sense, indulge in fleeting goals. Right? And not come out empty at the end of doing these various activities. Right? So that's in a sense, what's the relationship between the fleetingness of character and the fleetingness of goals? Right? The second question, which is in a sense the second component of your account of happiness, is the sense of relatedness. Right? You don't mention him in the text, but I think he's an unstated presence in what you're writing, even though you might not be fully conscious of it. And that's actually Karl Marx. The core of Marx's idea of alienation is this condition where we cannot relate to the activities that we engage in. Right? So happiness is not about just immersing yourself in an activity. God knows we are immersed in activity all the time, right? We are an overworked civilization. It is when you cannot actually relate to that activity in some respects. Right? And the second component I think you seem to be driving at is that it's not, I don't think your conception of happiness is about immersing yourself in activity. In some senses, you're critiquing that idea. It is what are the conditions under which we can actually relate to that activity in a way that it seems to give us purpose and meaning and seem our own. Now, the relatedness question, as I said, is a slightly different question from a non-instrumentality. I think question. The third component is your account of activity itself. That the reason for pursuing an activity, first of all, it has to be our reason. It has to relate to our purpose. It's related to me. But more importantly, that reason must have some connection with the intrinsic good of that activity. It must not be external to it. So you enjoy writing the book, it's related to your purposes, right? It's perhaps non-instrumental in some deep sense. You're not writing it because you want fame or because you think it's contributing to some sort of betterment of humanity or some instrumental goal. And the meaning you derive from activity is intrinsic to that activity itself. It's the goal of writing the book itself. It's not because it's distorted by some consideration or motivation that's external to that activity, right? So this is the kind of external reasons, internal reasons. And the fourth is this problem of the self, right? Which is in the activities that you take and the pressures of the world that you encounter, can you hold on to some robust sense of self and character that actually gives these activities, that binds them together, that gives them some sense of continuity? You yourself are not swept off the feet by every, in a sense, passing. Right? Now, it seems to me that in an Aristotelian world, in a purely religious world, all of these can go together, right? I mean, and partly what binds them together, right? Ultimately, whether it's in Aristotle, whether it's in Socrates or Plato, is the sense that there is something about the structure of the world, which, if we properly understood, right, if we have the proper form of knowledge, would bring all of this together. The activity chosen for the right reason, which is in accordance with our purposes, which we fully understand, right? And these are embedded in some eternal verities. So now, to me, I think when I read your trinity of self-possession, friendship, and living in accordance with nature, the character I thought most of was not Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, because I actually think their metaphysics is demanding. There is a certain kind of heroism, which I think even in your account of Socrates comes across. I mean, strangely enough, in the book, I see a kind of yearning for this heroism of refusal in some ways, right? But the figure I thought of was actually Montane, where you have self-possession, but it's not a self-possession that's unduly worried about the unity of agency. I mean, there's a kind of receptiveness to the world, receptiveness to yourself that flows in the kind of undulating, sort of experience in some senses of our own self. Right? It doesn't have that singularity striving that I think Socrates at the end does. Right? He has a great account of friendship that is, in a sense, based on enjoyment, and it's living in accordance with nature, which is a certain kind of, you might say, a kind of disinterested appreciation of literally every single moment that you actually encounter. Takes in this world of the senses much more than Socrates does, for example, right? Which is what the appreciation of nature would require. There's a kind of detached aestheticism even about the smallest things in life. And I would urge you to think about Montane as a better ally for your project than Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Right? Much more in tune with the modern condition, much more chilled and cool, which is what your book seems to be at one level striving at. But there's a kind of, it's sort of vitiated by a certain kind of quest for this heroism of refusal. Just wonder whether you want to actually think about more of that as a kind of ideal. David Hume, right? Play chess, activity for its own sake, find a few friends, and find a way of relating to actually the small pleasures of life. Right? Why tack on this quest for heroism in a book that is about non-instrumentality, about sort of obliterating the distinction between subject and object, going with the flows in such a way that you can at every moment, even in the face of bad adversity, relate to everything around you. So I'm kind of just throwing out this sort of very large kind of question. A lot more to say, but I just want to ask one more question and maybe leave it at that. This has to do with your your treatment of Robert Benigni's film, and I'm very sympathetic to your treatment. Although I have to say, Adam, if you watch TV and films and you want to write a philosophy book out of it, I say Adam is a good exemplar of a goal-driven life. I think most teenagers would say, chill, man, go with the moment. But the point about your critique of the Benigni film is not your reading of the film itself, which I think is marvelous, and I'm sympathetic. It's this one particular sentence where you say, in even the darkest moments, life is overflowing with the possibility of redemption and joy. And I want to ask you about the status of that statement. Is this a description of the world? Is this an act of hope a la Kant? I mean, and hope is precisely in the face of this kind of. Is it an obligation, right? That somehow we are morally obliged to think that even in the darkest moments of life is overflowing with the possibility. There's a lot of statements like these that are extraordinarily inspiring in the book, but depending on the register in which you read them, they might aid or hinder your project. If it's a description or if it's obligatory, it doesn't seem to be true to your project. If it seems like a performative act of hope, right? Then it's in a different register, but then it's not obligatory. I mean, I can imagine somebody saying, actually, in the darkest moments of life, it is not overflowing with the possibility of redemption and joy. That there is a kind of unrelatedness and violence you create by having me think that, right? And that I process that darkness, on my own terms. So I'm just trying to think of, what kind of an act of writing is this book? Is it an injunction to an obligation, right? Be happy in this way. Is it a description of how you think the world actually works? Or is it, an empowering personal individual act of hope?
Well, thanks, Pratap, for that immensely illuminating account of the themes, but also elaboration of ideas in ways that I haven't thought through. And to respond would warrant definitely a discussion, more sustained for sure than we can have in this context. But if I may just respond briefly to some of your many illuminating, thought-provoking points. Going back to the beginning, this idea of taking joy in the smallest things in life, living an utterly non-instrumental life to the extent that that's humanly possible. Yes, I think that's at the core of the book. That's really the ideal that I'm trying to point people toward and point myself toward in writing the book. And I would say that there's a difference between goal-oriented striving and directedness. So if I'm cleaning the dishes in the sink, I can interpret that activity from this perspective of goal-oriented striving. I need to get the dishes in the dishwasher out of the sink because otherwise I'm going to have a mess on my hands, and the next morning, I won't have enough room to put the breakfast dishes in, right? Very goal-oriented. But you could also interpret it along the lines you suggest of living a non-instrumental life in terms of attentiveness and care, that what you're really doing is, paradoxically enough, doing the dishes a service as well as yourself, that they demand a certain respect. This is a kind of Aristotelian idea that things deserve proper care and proper use according to their nature. And, especially in the case of things that we take pride in, or that have a kind of, we might say, sentimental value, the project of caring for them and repairing them and understanding ourselves as connected to those things that may be very mundane objects, but that nevertheless have a significance in the larger context of our lives. A simple dish as a part of a meal that we share with family, let's say, that there is a kind of intrinsic value to the activity, that if we attend to it and interpret it in the right way, we can derive a kind of deeper satisfaction from than simply goal-oriented striving. Now that's directedness, because you're directed toward caring for a certain thing that has meaning in the context of your life. But it's not goal-oriented in the sense that I mean to critique. And I think the point you made about non-instrumentality and relatedness is very interesting. I have to think more about it, but I think I do want to maintain that the two are connected, that to live a thoroughly non-instrumental life is to be attentive to the connectedness of what you're doing in one realm and how it touches upon the other realms of your life, so that there is a kind of holism to one's existence, such that when you engage in a certain activity, it can't just be about the success or failure in a particular domain, because what you're actually doing is engaging in an activity, realizing a certain capacity in yourself, but also in relation to the world, that carries over into everything else that you do. And we can think about this in many ways, being a teacher and attending to the perspective and the questions of your students, maybe quite naive questions, but ones that upon reflection are very profound and that you haven't thought about because you're blind to them, and carrying that over into your own life when you're no longer in the classroom. I think that appreciating activity for the sake of itself does imply a certain connectedness. But I'd like to think more about that and think about ways in which that can be articulated. Let me now just fast forward to the last comment you made, because it's very profound. What kind of claim am I making, especially when I say that even in the darkest moments, there's the possibility of redemption and joy? It's definitely not a mere description of the world, because if we're just speaking empirically, we see obviously that that's not true in many cases, that there are certain hardships that are simply insurmountable for people and for oneself, and maybe you're broken by them and you're unable to find redemption. That's certainly true. The statement is aspirational, but I would say aspirational not simply in the sense of a personal ideal or a moral obligation, but aspirational in a sense that does have purchase in the way the world actually presents itself. So I want to say that it's not an empirical claim, and it's not merely an obligatory claim, like a moral imperative, but rather it's an inspirational statement that also attends to the way in which the world presents itself, and even a disastrous turn of events. And I think Greek tragedy is very attuned to this. Here we're going back to a pre-Socratic source, but the Oedipus story that Sophocles gives us presents a life that is beset by the worst possible calamities, and yet in the story there's an ultimate redemption, a redemptive moment. It doesn't mean that in every such story there will be a redemptive moment, but that the possibility is there, and the way in which Oedipus is redeemed is through a certain act of grace or acceptance, ultimately, of those who know who he is, and know the terrible fate that's befallen him, but take him in nonetheless. So there's a kind of affirmation of the unexpected in life, both sending us down this spiral of despair against our best intentions. All of this tragedy befalls us. But just as there is that unexpected turn of events for the bad, there's also always the hope and the possibility of redemption and the joy attached to redemption. And part of it is reigning in a certain hubris associated with the goal-oriented perspective, that we can always see ahead what's coming. And often when we face some terrible turn of fate that we didn't see coming, we can fall into the equally, I would say, hubristic trap of thinking, well, this is all there is to life. I know for certain that I won't be able to come out from under this, or that life is wholly miserable. And there's something wrong about that. So I would say it's not an empirical statement, but an interpretive claim attending to the way the world presents itself, and also one that depends on personal resolve as well.
The audacity of the project, Adam, is one of the things that hit me in a very powerful way. If we think of habits of the heart, as being a kind of picking up on de Tocqueville in response to radical individualism. Kiku had just referred to that in this country. I would say that your book kind of seems to me to be a response to not radical individualism, but budding nihilism. That we're living in a world, it seems to, from my perspective, where we're really on the verge of looking at a nihilistic universe in a global sense. And this struggle for any sense that there is a truth of any sort, as well as values of any sort, etc., to me is a huge deal. So I see your book as audacious in raising the biggest possible question in relation to the breakdown of a moral order, of grounding, of meaning, of well-being, all those categories. And so that to me is very important. Secondly, the way you are really going for holism here, you use that term. So I want to apply it to the sort of the back and the forth about instrumental thinking, non-instrumental thinking. Hey, can we really avoid being goal-driven? No, that's important, bad, good, certainly inevitable and necessary. So that's related to a perennial human problem. But that is the big question: who am I as a human being? What does it mean to be human? That's really what is, I think, underlying the connection you make between self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature. Yes, they're linked by being non-instrumental in a culture that is so overwhelmingly instrumental. Well, one of the biggest problems of an instrumental universe is that we basically objectify ourselves, which is to say dehumanize ourselves. And in doing that, we also respond to other people by objectifying them. So the question is, what's the large frame of meaning in which to put the inevitability of goal-directed activity, some of which are worthwhile, some not, however we're evaluating that. And what I got was that you're basically making a large claim of framework of meaning in which to put the rest of the activities that constitute your life in its narrative arc. So the big frame is going to be, who am I, and self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature. That's going to be the larger frame in which to put the other, and then negotiate the back and the forth. I could go, I'm going to stop there, but raise a couple of questions in light of that. So that you go back to the great philosophers, or among the greatest of the philosophers, and bring other people in, to me is also a huge deal in terms of giving us the scope and the depth of what's required to answer this kind of question. However, I'm kind of wondering, when you talk about Socrates isn't just self-possessed in the ways that you've talked about, and clearly an integrated person. His life, his inner and his outer life are integrated, but it's a quest for truth. And it's not just a quest for truth, it's a quest for self-knowledge. It's to know oneself. That's the issue. To know what it means to be human, and to know what it means to be human in light of larger transcendent truths, whatever that is, even if the deepest insight he gets, because he is on the kind of quest you're talking about, where it's self-discovery as you go and self-knowledge as you go, but then it becomes not about self-possession, but self-transcendence. And what I mean by that is not that you get outside of yourself, but from within the deepest resources of your self-awareness, consciousness, grounding, you sense the connection between yourself and a larger truth or possibility for discovering insights of that truth. So I think that there's a religious sense of it, and that of course will transfer over to friendship, because you talk about friendship, it's getting out of self. They're non-instrumental, and engagement with nature is something that transcends the self, but you put yourself in it and then are connected with it. So the question that emerges from these musings is, why are you limiting yourself to these particular philosophers? These are your guides, and they have a lot to say to all of us. But I'm wondering that precisely because you picked Aristotle, well, let's go back to Plato, Socrates for sure, and then Aristotle, then you've developed it. Why aren't you broadening the conversation to include religious voices who are also part of that philosophic conversation? I mean, we know about Aristotle because of Muslim theology. Christianity, Judaism, basically are part of this philosophic discussion that's Aristotelian, as well as has other voices that could support and complement what you're saying. Yet you seem to stop short of including those voices. And yet you've critiqued rightly, I thought, the effect of the Enlightenment on our thinking in basically making the framework of meaning too narrow for us to appreciate non-instrumental thinking, that it's Enlightenment thinking that basically has sort of cramped us and accelerated the instrumental thinking that we have. So in a sense, are you doing that to some extent by not widening the conversation to voices that might provide language that is somewhat richer, complementary and supportive of what you're doing, as well as perhaps critical on certain points?
Well, thanks, Bernie, for that beautiful interpretation of the arc of the book, and for those questions. With regard to other thinkers, I'm guilty as charged. I mean, there's a certain limitation when one writes, of course, that you stick to those who you know best and who you've been thinking about for a long time. I think independently, there's a reason to start with Aristotle and to go back to Socrates, simply because of the distinctions that these philosophers draw that tend to be lost, as you say, in Enlightenment thought. Aristotle distinguishes very, very sharply between activity for the sake of a goal and activity for the sake of itself. So it's a natural starting point. There's a lot there. And he has the connection of self-possession and friendship, which I think is very nice. For Aristotle, self-possession comes under the heading of greatness of soul, which in the Ethics he considers the highest virtue. But equally, he considers friendship later on to be the highest virtue. And the two kind of go together in a mysterious and very thought-provoking way for Aristotle that I try to pick up on. So it's really that's my starting point, and by no means an end point. And I take your comment and suggestion very seriously, and in a way, it gives me joy that the project is ongoing. My very own philosophy, that I can pull in ideas from other thinkers who may infinitely enrich the notion of the good that I'm trying to articulate. I really liked the way that you put it, that self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature aren't simply three separate virtues or three things that I kind of cobbled together because I found them all compelling. And yeah, that's one ingredient, that's another, and that's a third. But they do, at least I'm trying to show, form a unity, that you can't really understand what it means to be self-possessed without knowing what it means to be a friend, and without coming to reinterpret yourself through being with friends and learning from friends and having conversations with friends. And here's where I think Socrates is quite a remarkable model, because his self-possession was tied to philosophy. And for him, philosophy wasn't abstract theorizing, but it was based in discussion and dialogue, in examining the opinions of an interlocutor, and sometimes even an opponent, and trying to work from those opinions to a deeper truth, not simply rejecting the opinions, but in a way establishing a sort of friendship with even somebody who at first seems so oppositional. So that the self-possession that Socrates has when he says the unexamined life is not worth living, that statement has such resonance for Socrates and gives him such strength precisely because of a confidence that flows from a form of friendship. And he often describes philosophy as a form of friendly discussion, as opposed to the kind of discourse that prevailed in the Athenian law courts, which was oppositional and which had to do with convincing a third party that you were right without even convincing yourself. And that's the fundamental difference between Socratic discourse and discourse aimed simply to defeat an opponent, which is a kind of goal-oriented discourse. So this tie between self-possession and friendship is very crucial to my project. And I think it's one that's brought out powerfully in the person of Socrates, at least on a certain reading of what Socrates' life was all about. And engagement with nature is something that came much more naturally to the Greeks. We have to articulate the virtue as moderns of engagement with nature, because we're faced with this disunity between the human and the natural that the ancients weren't faced with. And so for us, recovering a sense of engagement with nature, I would say, is essential to being oneself, to being self-possessed in the highest sense. And one's relation to nature, as I try to spell it out, does have to do with a kind of friendly relationship to nature, that you relate to nature as something that is other, but not merely external and not merely oppositional, but just as Socrates would relate to an interlocutor in discussion on the meaning of justice, of the good. So too, we can interpret nature as it first appears to us in its beautiful and sublime and threatening forms, and interpret from nature something that will empower us. And by the same token, preserve nature and cultivate nature. So there is a kind of friendly relationship there. So I see these as very, very connected, Bernie, along the lines that you articulate. But, absolutely, I think your suggestion of broadening it to other thinkers and other traditions is something that I should do, and that's inspiring, for further work.
Randy, I really appreciated your openness at the beginning, saying I see myself in that, because I do also, but I have to disagree with it also, the goal-driven life. I think, speaking about it from the perspective of youth and what we're doing to childhood and to being a young adult, and putting it in the perspective of constantly being so goal-oriented. I know people here that are either still in college or recently graduated, and most people here have had some sort, are either college professors or, deal with that population a lot. I just think of it from the perspective of what are we doing to students as they grow up, as they apply to college, as they participate in clubs, sports, which have become so regimented, so for an instrumental purpose of winning or gaining access to college, as if it's something that is this top pinnacle goal that we have to constantly strive for in some very linear direction, without taking time to pause on the reflections that you might gain from sport. I think that was kind of a situation that I found myself in with sports. And graduating from college, I started asking myself a lot of these questions of, why did we put so much emphasis during our childhoods and during our early young adult years on getting to this one place, on getting to this one degree, on achieving it, and then what now? And I think I was starting to ask myself a lot of these questions of, well, I had this satisfaction. What do I do with it now that sort of empty recalibrating feeling is there? And this book kind of opened up a lot of that dialogue for me. because it was a very instrumental, very linear perspective that we have on childhood and on youth now. And I start thinking, what is that doing to an entire group of people, to the next generation of people that are running this society? I will also add on to that, I really love the one section, Adam, where you started speaking about rhetoric and language. And this, because I find it so often in college, college classes where people sort of speak with this overbearing deference. It's weird to have college students saying, oh, I think I know, but I don't really know, but then and speaking so fast paced and you can't even understand what they're saying, and like on and on. And I found it to be kind of this weird paradox between having this very instrumental and goal-oriented striving to getting to a place. And then once you're there, it's this downfall, it's this empty feeling, this satiation that you're talking about that goes away, and you try and compensate for it by speaking in this very hurried rhetoric where you sound like you aren't entirely confident in yourself or assertive, and you can't engage in an actual dialogue with the people across the table with you. So I think I'd like to open up the conversation there. And what do we think about sports and this constant goal-oriented driving with sports, college and the way that looks like now, and what is it doing to youth and to childhood and to being a young adult?
I really resonate with that. And I think what comes to mind most for me goes back to this sense of alienation and what it means to be raised and to be coming of age and maturing while you're also looking at yourself through the form of social media, technology, how you engage with your peers and engage with your sense of self in a very public or personal archive online. And I can't help but hear, Lauren, what you have to say and some of the other commentary through that lens. That's been something that I'm always thinking about, for better or worse, and what it means to be satisfied and think about what it feels like and looks like to be satisfied in a public sense and in a way that communicates that to others. I think when I think about self-possession and happiness, I've also been thinking about what it means to measure that and portray that online, and to think about achievements, whether it's running a race or moving or starting a new job, like how you communicate that and express that in a form that almost alienates yourself from your actions and from your achievements and your accomplishments. So in this conversation, I'm curious how we think about what it means to present ourselves and an archive of our lives, and to constantly be perfecting ourselves and presenting ourselves as perfected entities, or even in a sense of even that in progress sense of self through social media. And social media is top of mind for me, but just in other ways that we have to constantly put ourselves in front of others, in front of these eyes of others. And Lauren, your point on kind of how you grapple with a previous satiation or satisfaction. I don't know the answer to that, but that's something that I think about almost every day, because it is so fleeting and it's ephemeral. And how do you sustain that how do you sustain that when you look back at, whether it's your photos of yourself or albums or this online archive of yourself, and looking back at yourself and the trajectory of your life and its accomplishments online? It's like that the doubleness or two-sidedness of who you are. Yeah, I think those are just my first impressions.
Yeah, Morgan, even like I was just about to say that when you were talking about how do you find sort of an antidote for this fleeting ephemeral moment, I think people use social media as that quick cure, that quick hit of, finding ways to continue this feeling of satisfaction and satiation and posting a goal-driven image of yourself online. and something that's treated as very ongoing, because you can keep posting, you can keep projecting this image of yourself without having to actually grapple with the self-possession or, you know, the current state that you find yourself in. So that's kind of where I've been finding social media, or the way that I've been thinking about social media, as this kind of immediate response to having to constantly, quote unquote, prove yourself to others, or to continue showing this goal-oriented life to others.
I think as Lauren, you were responding, I was thinking about two things that I think connect to Kiku, your question. One is a strange, non-linear approach to aspirational moments in your life. So for example, when I'm planning to meet up with a friend or go on a vacation, or I don't know, just any future moment, I'm already thinking about the archive of what that moment looks like in the past, and how it'll be documented, whether it's something that I post or whether it ends up in my photo album, because of how we're constantly thinking about how because of this digital mirror we have. And I think with friends, it's weird. I saw a friend last night that I hadn't seen in a while, but I felt a weird sense of proximity to her through just our online interactions. And it's this strange, I think that's the proximity and a false sense of intimacy through online engagement, through kind of keeping in touch through social media, texting. And I think that can feel, I think that goes back to a sense that's ephemeral and a sense that's fleeting. There's a, what's the word? A satisfaction that is met through kind of these digital touch points on social media, for better or worse. And you feel a stronger sense of, I feel a stronger sense of closeness until I actually meet up in person with that friend and realize that there are so many gaps emotionally and quite literally through how I come to know and interact with that person. We always talk about with social media, a sense of proximity we feel to others and how you can kind of keep in touch and the power of that, of course. But it is a fleeting sense that I think fulfills your ego almost, because all of that is measurable, the metrics, that the impressions, those touch points. I think in the end, it doesn't actually satisfy that stronger, sustained sense of fulfillment with friendship and love through those kind of digital touch points and the comment sections, all of that is what social media definitely embraces. But I think about that all the time when I meet up with someone that I haven't seen actually in a long time, but I think that I've seen them, or they live in my like imagination of our friendship just through these, online communities that we've created.
Morgan, I really like that point about when we start doing activities or we start meeting up with people, we start thinking about how we're going to curate and document this moment. Because I see a lot of people using social media, myself included, I'm guilty of this, but you use it to sort of document these big achievements in your life and these big moments. And you're consciously thinking through your graduation or this thing that you did or a wedding or whatever it is. How am I going to best present this on Instagram or online versus what am I actually taking away from the moment as is? So that's what I start thinking about when I start thinking of childhood, young adulthood, is like, what is happening to this entire demographic of people that are growing up, experiencing life and going through activities or the experiential world, thinking about how they're going to best showcase their achievements to a broader audience.
I have a question about how careers map onto the idea of happiness in action, and the life a life as a careerist. The career is the good life, I think, in our society. It's the dominant ideal of the good life. The most advantaged, most wealthy, most connected, most powerful people in the land and want their children to get into Professor Kennedy's classes so that they can have a career. And that's how I make my living, training people for, not training, educating people, but the reason I can do it is because of the confidence people have that a Dartmouth degree will lead to a good career. And now we might see this idea of, careers as just defective in all the ways you mentioned, that it's all about goals, it's all about money and social standing, and it's a recipe for unhappiness. And the book Happiness in Action is a corrective to this dominant idea. But I'd like to invite you to think about whether careers might be part of the idea of happiness in action. And could we see it as the life as a careerist, as a real contender? A couple images to consider. One, Paul McCartney playing in Fenway Park in June. I went to hear him, and how could I not go hear him? And it was a routine show. He just kind of he just went through the motions. And I loved him for just going through the motions. I loved it so much more because it wasn't an extraordinary show. It was a brilliant show. When Paul McCartney goes through the motions, it's absolute genius. He played 6 different instruments. He sung songs from, his 500 song corpus. But he was just doing it. It was another day at work. It was like me teaching a class that isn't a great class, but it's not a terrible class. It's just another Tuesday at 2:00, and I teach my class. And I do okay, and I feel okay about it, but it's not, it didn't change the world. It's not unforgettable. I just did a good job. And Paul McCartney did a good job, and I enjoyed seeing him at work. And I thought, this is a man who wakes up and goes to work. He's got all the money in the world. He's been the most famous person in the world for about 55 years. And he wakes up and he goes into the studio and he writes songs and he rehearses with his band. And he plays songs. He just shows up at Fenway Park and plays another concert. I'm sure he wants money, even though he's got it all. I'm sure he wants praise, even though he's been praised to the heavens his whole life. But I also just have the feeling that this is his characteristic activity. This is his ergon, the Greek word. This is his activity. This is his thing. This is just Paul McCartney doing his thing. And I actually did find it very inspiring. I thought, this is how I should do my thing. I should just go in and do my thing. Teaching should be my thing. And I should do it a lot like Paul McCartney. Or imagine, here's a second image. Imagine a surgeon at Mass General. Mass General is this like the modern, what the cathedrals were to the Middle Ages, Mass General is to our age. This monument to the cathedral of the body. And imagine, a gastrointestinal surgeon at Mass General. Nothing to, and she goes in and does her job every day, and she wants to ascend the hierarchy at Mass General. I don't even know what that is, but I'm sure that there are like higher and lower ranks there. And she wants to be chief surgeon or whatever. And she wants to make a lot of money and have a house on the Cape to visit on the weekends. And she wants luxuries and she wants status. But she also wants to save people's lives and alleviate suffering. And I think that those great surgeons, they do their thing. They have an activity and they're oriented to it. And they do it even when they stop needing the praise and the money, they still do it at their best. So could careers be an example of, happiness in action? And that's the question. And just in the background, Adam, I guess is the deeper question, how defective is the modern answer to insatiability? So there's this psychological fact that your book starts with, which is that we can never be satisfied. And so we have these desires for, the stuff that keeps us going, food and water and sex, but also being seen and looked up to. And the classic account says that a life spent trying to satisfy these desires will result in grave unhappiness. That the most successful people at satisfying their desires, the kind of tyrants, are lonely and friendless and tortured because their desires just get bigger and bigger the more they satisfy them in this kind of torturous thing. And it's better to overcome desires through piety or philosophy, or I guess the contemporary answer in the nation of Massachusetts is getting stoned. But the modern answer says, don't overcome restlessness and insatiability, use it, but use it in an enlightened way. And the long and short of it is, I think the modern answer delivers us to careers. And it takes this insatiability, but tries to move it in a way that's not violent and that's not woefully unhappy and self-destructive. So is that a good example or not a good example of happiness in action?
Russ, it's a great question about career, and I think it's such a difficult question. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think that a career can be an integral part of activity for the sake of itself, of the happiness in action that constitutes a good life. But what's so interesting about careers is that more and more these days, people are finding themselves beaten down by the career. So the image of The Office, in the show The Office that you, Russ, I know, discuss in some of your work on work, the image of like the massive bureaucracy, kind of the middle manager who's under the thumb of the boss and who's kind of going in and day out and subjecting himself to all of this abuse for the sake of just trying maybe to get that promotion. And this image has pretty deep roots in our cultural imagination. It's not only recently, but if you go back to some of the classic films that are my favorite and that I discuss in the book, Double Indemnity is a great film noir where the protagonist is led down this path of self-destruction and crime, and precisely because he's this insurance salesman who's bored with what he does, and he works for this big impersonal firm. Fast forward to another one of my favorite shows, Breaking Bad, the whole thing that sets this guy Walter White on the path toward cooking meth, through which he paradoxically gains a lot of self-possession and becomes a better person in many respects, and a worse person in other respects. Obviously, we know that. But what's interesting about the show is that it starts with his work, with his day job, which is to be a high school chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And his students are like, throwing paper planes and shooting spitballs and flirting and gossiping while he's earnestly trying to teach chemistry. And he's utterly, he's this brilliant guy who finds himself in a misfitting job in a role that he really shouldn't be in. He's got this backstory of how he was a brilliant chemist. Anyway, I think career cuts both ways, because a lot would have to change in the way I think work is structured these days, maybe at all times to a certain extent, for us to find the kind of deep satisfaction of happiness in action in our jobs. But Paul McCartney is a great example. And I think of people like Roger Federer, who just announced he's retiring. Roger Federer on the tennis court. I had a chance to watch him many years ago when he was in his prime at the US Open. And similar to the Paul McCartney experience, you see somebody whose very being and self is very much defined by their characteristic activity, the grace with which he moves on the tennis court. And I think one thing that's very notable about Roger Federer or Paul McCartney, or people who we see at work and are kind of with them in admiration as we observe them at work, is that there is something that goes beyond goal-oriented activity. Yeah, sure, Paul McCartney, well, at this stage, he's accomplished so much, but, he probably planned for the show to some extent, probably as a template. He wanted it to go well, wanted the crowd to be good. So there is a kind of goal orientation to it. I think same, maybe even more obviously with Roger Federer, who's trying to win a tennis match, that's very goal oriented. But there's something intrinsic to the performance or the play. And play, I think, is a really nice concept that I don't really address in the book. Maybe I touch upon it, but I probably should do more with it. The relation between work and play, that there is a certain playfulness to work at its best, where it still may be for money, and it may be your day job, but a kind of exploratory aspect to the work, where the work itself is an adventure. And the rest, you talk about teaching a class, going in and teaching, but also trying to formulate ideas as you teach in relating to students, and kind of coming to an insight, that the kind of being in the moment of it, I think, is crucial and makes the teaching authentic. It's not like you just have a plan. And I know you do this brilliantly, because I've seen you teach, and it's something that I aspire for when I'm teaching, is that, you don't want to follow a script, and you don't want the class to be too goal oriented, both because it'll lose the students most likely, but also because you deprive yourself of a kind of light bulb moment, or the kind of intrinsic joy of saying something in a slightly different way that may resonate. And so in short, I think, yeah, work in a career can be an integral part of the good life, of activity for the sake of itself, but it depends so much on what kind of work it is you do.
Thank you. First of all, I'm so happy to be here. I've so much missed these events. I can't wait for the time where we do this in person again. I'm almost halfway through the book, which is here, and I have a fake background, and I hope that at some point we can also present it or do something with the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. I cannot think of a better kind of outreach for Hellenic studies than a book like that. I see. So there's this critique of instrumentalism, also a critique of utilitarianism, and this idea of measuring happiness in terms of pain and pleasure and subjective experiences. So going back to what Kiku said, I wanted to ask about the precise relationship, if there is any, between eudaimonia, or happiness as presented in this book, and some kinds of subjective experiences. I'm going to make it clearer. So Pratap mentioned Marx and alienation, and we know that somebody can be alienated in a Marxist way and still feel perfectly happy. It's not the subjective experience of malaise that is the definition of alienation. In the same way, somebody can feel joyful, happy in this kind of naive everyday sense of the world, and not experience happiness as presented in this book. And then, Adam, as you explained, one can be happy in the sense that you present in this book, having this eudaimonia, while facing adversity, struggle, unpleasant feelings. So there's one possible interpretation, which is that the two are completely unrelated, that there's no way to go from one to the other. But I suspect that the relation is more complicated. So my question is, are there types of subjective experiences that are somehow hints at, or symptoms of, or byproducts or side effects of that kind of eudaimonia as you describe it? And in general, can you map this out a little bit? Are there subjective experiences that I would recognize as being symptoms of that, or not? Can you help us get a map of that kind of connection?
Yes, it's a really great question, Nicholas, and one that I've struggled with, actually, to some extent, because part of my claim is that is to demote the subjective experience. And you say, well, what if you're just miserable? Isn't it really strange that you could feel subjectively really bad, anxious, depressed, sad, despondent even? But
it would be something counterintuitive if there was a connection at all, right?
And then you say on the other side, well, maybe you feel really good about yourself, self-satisfied, but actually what you do is very empty in a sense, so that on a certain level, you wouldn't be happy in this sense of eudaimonia, the kind of action. And I don't, as you rightly anticipate, I don't want to disconnect this subjective feeling or the mental state from the activity, but I want to connect them, but maintain a certain priority to the activity, that somehow the feeling and the meaning of the activity are connected. And that to the extent that we we recognize the meaning of what we do and can articulate it, and it's not easy always to articulate the meaning of what we do, but to the extent that we can, that has the potential at least to change the way we feel. But you can't really go in the reverse. There is no kind of bringing about or engineering of a feeling that is going to get you to meaning. So the two are deeply connected with a certain fundamental priority connected to the activity. And I think retrospection and interpretation matters a lot here, because when we're in the midst of something, we may have a sense, a very deep sense that it's meaningful, but because of the immediacy, because the event hasn't unfolded, because the implications haven't been spelled out for us, we're at the beginning, we're coping with something very directly. We don't have the language yet, and we don't have the story, the full story yet, in light of which we can recognize it as integral to a good life, and thus a kind of instigation to a feeling of pleasure. And I want to give a lot of credit to retrospection and storytelling as important, that an experience takes a while to settle in and unfold, and that if we judge the worth of the experience by the pleasure or pain we're feeling in the moment, we may very well deprive or fail to recognize the significance of the experience and the deeper joy that it will bring once we understand it better at a later point. I mean, think of Odysseus at sea, facing these terrible trials and the unhappiness, subjectively, I mean, he must have felt in the midst of this, will I ever get home? Will I ever see my wife, Penelope? But I'd also be willing to bet, if we tried to put ourselves in his situation, that the joy he felt in reuniting with his wife at the end of it all was of an entirely different kind and a deeper joy than he had in seeing her in previous moments of separation and return, because of all of the experiences that he underwent to return home. And that kind of retrospective joy, I think, is something crucial. And I think it gives us strength as well in those tough times, where we can at least maintain a faith that what is so terrible now and what is bringing me so much stress and sadness may actually be something meaningful once I work it out. So the feeling is connected to the activity, and the activity is, in a sense, primary, but it's very difficult to articulate, and it's something that I'm going to continue to try to think through. I think friendship is essential, and I would say that friendship extends beyond the immediate people who you call your friends, but includes the potential interpreter who you may never even know. You may be somebody, I don't know, who struggles immensely and is faced by such hardship, and let's say, just for the sake of example, you write about it and you try to convince yourself that it's possible to overcome, and you do so quite eloquently. Yet throughout all of your lifetime in your writings, that feeling of happiness, the subjective feeling, may never come. But what you've written may fall into the hands of somebody who picks it up and reads it, and who is facing something similar to what you faced in their own way. And it has such a profound effect on them that they're able to rescue themselves, or that they're able to experience the feeling that never came to you. It's this idea of connectedness, that we are connected to friends, but also friends who we may not even know, or who may be generations ahead of us. And when you think of the persistence of ideas and stories, take a dialogue of Plato, or take the Bible, or take any any story that has resonated with people for a very long time, what those characters depicted in those stories were feeling at any given time doesn't figure really that much, or maybe it does figure. We see them depicted lamenting, in tears, but what we take from it may in a sense redeem them and redeem their suffering if we can apply it in a thoughtful way to our own lives and take comfort and feel better in doing that. So I want to preserve a very expansive notion of friendship that goes beyond those in one's immediate circle and includes friends of the future, unforeseeable friends. And when you look at things that way, the connection of happiness as a feeling to happiness as a way of being is always there, at least potentially.
Really quickly, a lot of this has reminded me of this show. I encourage you to watch it. It's just one season so far, at least. The premise is there's, as I mentioned in the chat, there's a medical procedure that allows you to sever your work identity and your memories from your personal life. So you bring your physical being to work. As you go up the elevator, you forget who you are outside of work, and you take on a different persona of work. When you leave, you forget what you've done from work. So there's that quite literal alienation, doubleness. And just some of what I've heard recently makes me think, the presentation of the protagonist is just true misery. He's completely miserable at work, outside of work. So clearly the ethos of separating or creating work-life balance or separation doesn't actually create any fulfillment in his life. And maybe it's because he's unable to interpret or make meaning or sense of his labor, of his suffering, unable to connect or remember the camaraderie that develops through his friends at work or the friendships he makes. These are just some hypotheses that some of this discussion makes me think of, but it's a good or very literal articulation of this work-life balance ethos, and on it being unable to confront your own lived experiences.
I'll ask my question by making 3 points of reference I'd ask you to pick up. One, who was it? Was it Plato? Was it Socrates? Who was it who asked the question, would you rather be a pig happy or a human unhappy? And I know you'll tell us who it was, and I'd love to know how you would answer it. The second point of reference is Camus' last line in the Myths of Sisyphus. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. What could he have meant by that? And third, there was a subtitle of the wonderful book, What's Become of the Common Good? You'll remember the book was entitled The Tyranny of Merit. My question to you is, how does the common good come into your assessment of happiness? Can we be happy in a world, and one could suggest we're in one, that is in danger of falling apart? How does the common good impede or call out the individual's happiness? So if you take on those 3 small points, I'd be grateful.
Well, the first point, your quote, is actually from John Stuart Mill, who is a modern philosopher, utilitarian philosopher, but he was trying to distinguish between pleasure and the good. And he said, for speaking in his own voice, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So he did have some notion beyond the typical utilitarian pleasure versus pain of meaningful activity. Socrates, the pursuit of wisdom, that the kind of pleasure you derive from a kind of activity, the activity of philosophy, is in some sense higher than the pleasure of the pig, or speaking from a personal, human perspective, the pleasures, associated with food, drink, revelry, and the like, that those are somehow less substantial. And that's very much connected to the claim that really opens the book, that happiness isn't simply about pleasure, that there's something fleeting and empty in many of the pleasures we pursue as kind of an escape from the workday and from the pressures of goal-oriented life. And so let me get to the third question, because I think the common good is very crucial, and it's not a theme that I address directly in the book, but it's something that needs to be addressed. And I would make two observations. The first is that it does implicitly come in through friendship, because friendship is already a form of community. It's not a very large political community, but it's a community. It involves difference and dialogue and overcoming difference, reconciling differences, and growing together through discussion. And friendship may be somewhat of a hopeful model for the kind of being together in politics, especially in a large country like the one we live in. The idea that we can be friends with our fellow citizens seems almost outlandish when we consider the divisions and the polarizations throughout the country, that we can relate to a fellow citizen as a friend. But I think we have to try if we're going to have a common good, that there have to be reference points, and there have to be shared experiences and the kind of history that defines friendship. Whether it's possible to be happy in a society, happy in the deep sense, happy in the sense of eudaimonia, in a society riven with conflict, is a very difficult question. On the one hand, if you live in a society where you're recognized, and getting back to Russ's point about your job, your profession, your work, where your work is recognized as part of an economy that celebrates what you do as somehow fitting into a common good, because you contribute something distinctive and that matters and that helps the country flourish. I think that definitely makes makes happiness in action through a career much more possible. I still want to preserve the idea that even in the worst of political circumstances, and Socrates lived in a pretty bad time. I mean, we're talking about the disintegration of Athens, war between Athens and Sparta, that actually formed the backdrop of his difficulty and his condemnation. It was no coincidence that Socrates was hauled into court then, when Athens was falling apart. It was this cultural epicenter, really, in Greece for many years, and it was disintegrating actually at the time in which Socrates lived. There is immense factionalism between oligarchs and democrats. Socrates was denounced actually as a sophist by his democratic accusers, as kind of this elitist. Anyway, he was living in a very dark political time for Athens when he met his fate. And yet I want to preserve the possibility of maintaining oneself, maintaining self-possession, friendship, engagement with nature, living a good life, even in those times, even in the worst possible political circumstance. So I don't want to say that the common good is a necessary, that a stable common good, to the extent we ever have that, is a necessary condition for realizing happiness in action. But it certainly helps. And it certainly is necessary if we are to realize happiness in action from our political engagements, and probably from our economic involvements as well, that does require some kind of a common good.
I think a proper account of happiness would actually require an account of at least four things to get this. It's not just about activity or whether it's a subjective state of mind, right? So first is the proper form of self-knowledge that in a sense is appropriate to producing happiness. And that's in a sense the Socratic project. That's the project of every great philosopher, from Spinoza to Montane to Hume, right? Which is, what do we know about ourselves? And that is that the form of self-knowledge that can actually do full justice Even Freud, for that matter, actually, that it doesn't leave all these unacknowledged things floating around that we are not fully in grip of. Right? So, and it seems to me, I think it's the difficulty of answering that question of what constitutes an appropriate form of self-knowledge is one of the reasons why we've given up that happiness project in one sense. So that's the first component, right? The second is, of course, the embodiment of happiness, which is in activity and work, which is how does happiness relate to the fact that we are embodied creatures, we move, we work. I mean, and I mean work not just in the Homo faber sense of making, crafting, but the sense of enlightenment. I mean, we are creatures of the imagination, and in that sense, extend ourselves, right? The third is, in a sense, and that's where I do think you do need a bit of stoicism, which is how do both of these components, our self-knowledge and the way, in a sense, we embody and manifest ourselves in the world, actually relate to the overall structure of the world. Some account, I mean, in religious terms, you might call it theodicy, but implicitly, we all have one in some senses that actually relates to our account of happiness, how we react to suffering, how we react to causal processes in the world. And I think you do a wonderful job of sort of talking about the activity and the nature of that embodiment, that it has to be non-instrumental and stuff. But I think fleshing out the account of self-knowledge and your sense of the underlying theoretical structure of the world, that would actually flesh out what it properly means to have a full theory of happiness. And I suspect the reason we retreat to subjective states is because we are so unsure, post-Nietzsche, post-Freud, about what self-knowledge means. And we are even more sure, I think, post the 20th, and less sure post the 20th century, about what assumptions we can make, in a sense, about the way we insert ourselves into the world. That, the easiest option is then to say, well, it must be a subjective state or state of mind.
I want to go back to as I've heard this discussion, which has been fascinating. I've heard the participants in the discussion offering different takes on how Adam or someone concerned with his questions might reply to Randy's challenge at the beginning, which was a fundamental challenge. Why not live a life of fleeting, ephemeral achievements? What's wrong with such a life? So Randy laid down a very direct challenge. And in different ways, I've heard people offer you, or offer in the spirit of your project, answers to that question, which all have something to do with making meaning of a life. Morgan, in her example just now about the TV show Severance, described the protagonist as being incapable of making meaning. Pratap emphasized the non-instrumentality of every moment, the idea, drawing on Oakeshott, in an essay where Oakeshott's gesturing toward religion, that there is something more permanent than itself in every moment. So he was offering a kind of religious sensibility. Bernie Steinberg talked about and attributed to your view the need for a larger frame of meaning. And then he asked, so don't you, if you want a larger frame of meaning, don't you need to talk about transcendence? Because isn't that what a larger frame of meaning points toward? Transcendence. And then there was Russ, who seemed to offer what seemed to be an alternative to transcendence as a larger frame of meaning. Russ offered the larger frame of meaning of a career, which doesn't necessarily seem to traffic in transcendence. Maybe there are versions of it that does, and Russ has written about the idea of a calling, so maybe there's some connection. So my question, looking at all of the proposals that people have made in the name of your project or their view of your project, is it seems that you're suggesting there has to be a larger frame of meaning to a life, to a good life. That's the answer to Randy. But the question that's still hanging is, are you a friend of transcendence, or is that at odds with your project? You talk about self-possession and engagement with nature, but does and clearly you're in favor of transcending the goal or transcending the moment or transcending this or that achievement. But when you talk about self-knowledge in nature and our engagement with nature, do you think that the good life requires transcendence? Or maybe the question is, in what sense transcendence as a way to making meaning?
Well, that's a fundamental question, and it really goes back to Bernie's point, which is a beautiful point, that you need transcendence. And I would say, yes, that activity for the sake of itself, happiness in action, requires transcendence. The problem is that we often think of transcendence in a mistaken way, because we're operating with a very individualistic conception of the self, and what is transcendent is somehow external to the self, in the beyond, or disconnected from the self in some fundamental way, maybe disconnected from this world altogether. So transcendence is a very difficult term to deal with, but taking it without that baggage, but simply in the sense of going beyond, that there has to be a larger frame of meaning, more to yourself than you know and can conceptualize here and now. And beyond that, a deeper connectedness. I think transcendence requires connectedness. And I think it requires mystery, unknowability. Not unknowable in the sense that you can't know anything about it or relate to it in any way, but there has to be some openness and mystery that is fundamental to life, such that there is a constant movement beyond, or that every moment of your existence is a stepping into the unknown, or an openness to what's beyond the horizon that confronts you. So transcendence, yes, but I would interpret the self. Maybe one could think about it this way: insofar as you gain self-knowledge in partnership with friends, there is already a kind of transcendence, both a reaching out where you have a larger frame of reference through dialogue, from a perspective that confronts you, that you can't anticipate, that you didn't choose, that you didn't expect. And through that encounter with that perspective, through working it out, you gain self-knowledge and you gain appreciation of the other as actually somebody connected in the most fundamental sense to who you are. So there is already a kind of transcendence in friendship and the kind of self-knowledge gained in friendship. But we can't leave it at that, because any self-knowledge you gain, any insight you gain, directs you toward further questions and further possibilities. And there is a kind of radical openness to life. And what I try to get at in the part of the book that gave me the most trouble, and that did, I think, for good reason, that it's the toughest theme, is thinking about the meaning of time. And I think the issue of transcendence does go back to the meaning of time and the relationship between past and future. And when we think of the past in the most fundamental sense, I would say the past is what's established, or that which orients, that which directs, that which pushes you along and gives you the horizon that you have, that there's a certain closure to life in every moment, that's who you are, not as an individual, but all of the paths that you've walked, your friends, your connections, your involvements, how they fit together. There's a certain whole to your life that you can bring to expression, at least in some sense, and in different ways, in different moments, but that there is this directedness and closure to every moment. But at the same time, there is a radical openness, and that the closure that defines your sense of self, it isn't what it is, except as exposed to this fundamental possibility of the unknown and of rupture and of disruption, and that forces you to go beyond yourself, and that we are transcending ourselves in every moment, but we don't always recognize it, and the failure to recognize it can actually be very debilitating, because it leads to a narrowness of view and a narrowness of focus. So that I think transcendence is essential to self-possession, and paradoxically, somehow absolute closure and absolute openness go together, that they're not opposites, that you can actually step into the unknown only to the extent that you hold fast to certain commitments and strive to maintain those commitments. And this is expressed, I think, it's a big idea that's very hard to articulate, but I think it's expressed very, very nicely, at least gestured toward in very everyday phrase, simple everyday phrases that we use to express our commitments. The most, when we say, oh, I love you no matter what, I'll stand by your side no matter what. Well, it's a beautiful thing to say, and it expresses a kind of rock solid commitment. And you might say, well, on the one hand, it means you've already anticipated your future. What is your future? It's going to be more of today, because I'm not letting this commitment go. I'm going to stand by this person's side. But at the same time, it is inviting the future and its unfathomable mystery, because that statement only has meaning and weight and significance as the kind of expression of a rock solid commitment, because you don't know what the future will bring, and because you're ready to confront a challenge. And in that confrontation, I think, is transcendence, so that you can't have self-possession and friendship without transcendence. And I would say that one way of getting at it is a kind of openness, or the future in the genuine sense, not a future, not a goal-oriented future, where the future is a moment yet to come. It may or may not come to pass as I want it to. That's not the future in the genuine sense. The future is what you can't foresee. It's mystery, and it's the beyond. So self-possession and transcendence have to somehow go together.
This has been a fascinating discussion of the sources of happiness. I want to thank everyone who's participated from around the world, and a special thanks to Adam Sandell, Randall Kennedy, and Pratap Mehta for leading the discussion. See you next time.